What's up, everybody? It's Steph, and today I'm going to talk about the JavaScript basics and fundamentals that I think you should understand before learning Svelte. I know when you first start learning JavaScript, you're going to be eager to jump into a framework, but I can tell you from experience, it is not a good idea to learn JavaScript and a framework simultaneously. That is exactly what I did. I jumped straight into the Vue framework, so I was learning JavaScript as I learned Vue, and in the long run, it caused some issues for me. I had a hard time differentiating between what was JavaScript and what was the Vue framework, so when it came to solving my own problems and learning more complex ideas, I really struggled, and I had to take a step back and kind of relearn some of the JavaScript basics separated from the Vue framework. So I decided to make a list of things that I think you should know before learning the Svelte framework. Now I am singling out Svelte rather than any JavaScript framework, because Svelte is special in that it uses no boilerplate code and very little Svelte-specific syntax, so I think you need to know less going into this framework than I would recommend for other frameworks such as Vue and React. So in this video, I'm going to build a photo gallery using all of these fundamentals. Every now and then I will compare it to how you would do this with Svelte so you can see where they're similar, but also where they differentiate. And at the end of it, I will show you how to fetch some photos from an API. Let's start off by looking at the photo gallery we're going to build, and then we'll get into it. So here's an example of what we're going to build, and we're going to slowly add everything we learned to this until we have the completed project. And then at the end of the project, I'm going to show you how to fetch data from an API so that we can get these images from Unsplash. And the way it's going to work is you can search any keywords such as tree, click search, and it's going to display the images that are returned based on that keyword in our HTML. Each image will have a description if a description is returned with its data, and if you click it, you can visit this image in Unsplash. So the first thing we need to understand to get started is the structure of JavaScript and statements. So let's get learning. So first, let's go over the basic code structure of JavaScript. Here we have an HTML file, so within our HTML tag, we have 3 additional tags. A script tag, which is where we will write all of our JavaScript code, a body tag, which is where we will put our HTML, and finally a style tag, which is where we add all of our CSS styling. Let's start in our script tag, which is where we will write our JavaScript, and JavaScript runs on statements. A statement is just a group of executable code terminated with a semicolon. So in this example, I am using a built-in JavaScript function called console.log, and I am passing in what I want to print in the console as its parameter. So in this case, we are going to see this will print in the console, printed in the console, as you can see right there. Now, it's important to point out that statements run in the order in which they are written. So I'm going to change this text to say first, and then I'm just going to go ahead and add some more console.log statements. And you're going to see that each statement is going to run in the order in which they're written. So we'll see the first one first and the second one second. Now I'm going to add another statement. This time it's going to be using the built-in alert function, which will make a pop-up alert bubble with the text that we pass in. And this will run last. So if I go and refresh the page, we see our 2 console statements print, and then we see our alert. I'm going to click OK here. The last thing I want to point out is that JavaScript is case sensitive. So if I were to go to our console.log statement and change that C to an uppercase C and refresh the page, we are going to see an error. It says console is not defined. So a variable with an uppercase letter is not the same as the same spelled variable with lowercase letter. And this can trip up beginners in the beginning, so it's important to just be aware of what you're naming your variables. It's also important to note that when an error like this occurs, it's going to stop executing our code. So we have an error at that console log statement, and as a result, our alert statement never runs. So now I'm going to delete our alert statement and briefly go over basic HTML and CSS. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail with HTML and CSS, but it is important to understand in order to be successful in web development. But essentially, HTML has different elements that you can add. So for example, I'm going to add an h1 tag or a header element, and it will say image library. Now, if we save and refresh the page, we will see this header show up on our page with the specified text. I'm also going to add an image tag. An image tag takes an src, which is just the path to the image, and it will display the image in our DOM, as you can see on refresh. Now let's add some really basic CSS styling. So in our style tag, we can add styling by the element or by class or ID. So by element, you just say the element name, which is h1, and then you can add styling. So I'll make it bolder and give it a text color of blue. And if we refresh, you will see that our text is blue and bold. So this will apply to any h1 element on our page. We can also add CSS using a class. So I'm going to give this image tag a class of image and then say dot image, and I can add styling. Now this styling will only apply to elements that have the class image. So if I refresh, you can see I changed the width of our image. Now we understand that JavaScript runs on statements in order, it's case sensitive, and we have some really basic HTML and CSS. So now let's go over how to create variables and assign values to those variables. Now there are 3 different ways that we can declare a variable: using var, using let, and using const. The difference between var and let is pretty minuscule, and I'm not going to cover it. They're pretty interchangeable, but const is a little special, and I will go over why in just a second. But let's look at some examples of how we can declare variables and assign them values using these 3 methods. So I'll say var image src equals and just give it the path to our image, and this declares a variable image src and assigns it its value, which is a string going to the image. Next, we can use let in the exact same way. We just say let image description equal, and again I will just assign it to a string with a description of the image. So I'll say a snow-covered mountain. Here we have declared the variable image description using let, and we give it a value of a snow-covered mountain. Finally, we can do the same thing with const. We just say const date uploaded equals, and it will once again be a string with a date. And so now we have declared and defined 3 different variables using 3 different ways. So if we log all of these, we will see that all 3 values, being the string of our image path, the string of our description, and the string of the date uploaded, are being printed in our console. It's important to know that when declaring variables, they must have a unique identifier. So here we already have a variable called image description. If we say let image description equal and I assign it to a new value, I will just say this is a new value for the variable image description. And then down in our console log statement, let's only log image description. And then if we refresh our page, we're going to see an error that says image description has already been declared. And that's because you cannot declare a variable twice. We can, however, redefine a value. So let's get rid of the let and simply say image description equals and then our new value. I'm going to copy our console log statement and paste it under where we initially declare image description. And so the first time this logs, we're going to see the first value, which is a snow-covered mountain. And the second time, we're going to see our updated value that says this is a new value for the variable image description. And this is because we are not redeclaring it, but we are reassigning its value. So now let's go refresh our page, and there you see our image description being logged twice, once with its original value and once with its updated value. So we can assign a variable a value when we first declare it and then reassign that value later, but we can also declare a variable without a value. So here I deleted the value for image description, and now image description will not be assigned a value until later on in our code down here. So let's refresh our page, and now we see the first time it gets logged, it is undefined, and the second time it has our value. So we can declare a variable with no value, but it will be undefined until we assign it a value, as we can see in the console. I don't want image description to be undefined, so I'm just going to move its value back up to where we declare it, and I'll remove that extra console log statement. Now I want to point out that we can redefine values when they are declared using var and let, but any value declared with const can never be reassigned a new value. So in our example, date uploaded can never be given a new value because it is a constant variable. It is declared using const. The next important thing to understand are the different data types. So far we've been working with strings. All of our current variables have values that are strings, which is any textual data between either single or double quotation marks. So it can be letters, numbers, symbols, anything between the quotation marks qualify as a string. The next data type I want to go over is number, which is just any number with or without decimal places. So if we create a variable called image ID and assign it a number 12 and log it, we can see that 12 is being logged in the console. If we say type of image ID, it will be number. Now, if we were to surround this number with quotation marks, we will see that the type of number ID is now a string. So just because a value contains numbers does not mean it is a number. If it is surrounded by single or double quotation marks, it'll always be a string. The next data type to go over is called a Boolean, which can only be one of two values, true or false. So let's create a variable called showImage and set it equal to true. This is a Boolean, and notice that true is not written within quotation marks, because again, if we write it within quotation marks, it'll be a string. So it is just the value true, and if we log the type of showImage, we will see that Boolean is being logged in the console. So now we have all of these variables describing a single image. We have the image SRC, the description, the date loaded, the image ID, and whether or not the image is being shown. What if rather than having 5 different variables, we want all of this data to be stored under a single image variable? We can do that using an object. The object data type is a bit more complex than the other data types we've already talked about. It allows you to store collections of data in key value pairs surrounded by curly brackets. So let's create our object. We can say var image object equals and then have open and close curly brackets. Next, we can add our key. Our first key will be image src, and we're going to put this within a string. And then we can add its value, which is going to be another string, and it will be this URL going to our image. Now, all of the variables that I defined up above, I'm going to add them as keys in this object, and I will transfer their value as the value associated with that key. The value of each key can be any data type, a string, number, Boolean, another object, any type, but each key value pair must be separated by a comma. Now we have a single variable, image object, and its value are key value pairs describing our single image. If we go ahead and log this in our console, we will see each key with its associated value listed in the console. This makes our data much more manageable and easy to read. One thing worth noting is that keys are always going to be strings. So here I added quotation marks around our keys, but oftentimes these quotation marks can be removed. It's only if you're using special characters or reserved words that you need to use quotation marks. So I'm going to remove those and just refresh the page, and we see the exact same thing being logged in our console. Now in our console log, let's just say type of and refresh the page just so we can ultra prove that it is an object. Now, what if we want to access a single value associated with a key within our object? So for example, if we just want the value of image description, we can do this by saying image object dot image description. If we refresh our page, we see the value associated with that specific key. We can do this another way using square brackets. So if we surround this in square brackets and quotation marks and delete the dot and refresh the page, we will still see that exact same value. Now all of our data for our image is stored in a single variable. It's easy to read, easy to access. But what if we want a variable that stores multiple images? So we want to display more than this single image object. We can do this using an array. So an array is actually a type of object, so it's still used for storing multiple values within a single variable, but rather than using key value pairs, it can be thought of more as a list. So to create an array, we will encapsulate a list of values separated by commas within square brackets. Each value can be any data type and has a numeric position known as its index. The array index starts at 0, so the first item in the array is array 0 rather than array 1, and the second item will be 1, followed by 2, 3, 4, etc. So let's create an array. We'll say var images equals and then open and close square brackets. And then to start off, let's make it really simple, and I'm just going to list some strings. I'll say apple, banana, and orange, just some fruits. And if I log this images array and refresh our page, we will see the array being listed, and each item in the list has an index. And as I already stated, you see that the first item, apple, has an index of 0, banana 1, and orange 2. Now, I should have actually named this fruits, but we're going to update that to be multiple image objects, so we can keep the name as images for now, copy and paste our image object within the array, and if we refresh, we can see that it has one value within this array at index 0, and it is our image object. Now I want to add another image object within this array, and we already have image object defined up above, so I'm going to add that variable as our second value. If we refresh our page, we can see that now we have two identical objects being listed in our array. The first is at index 0, the second is at index 1. And if I go back to our image object and just update some of these values and refresh the page, you'll see that now they are no longer identical, they are two separate objects. So here the first ID is 12 and the second is 13, showing that we have our two different objects being displayed within this array. So how would we access only the first item in this array at index 0? We can do that using square brackets after images and then just put the number 0, and if we refresh our page, we will only see that first object listed in our array. If we were to replace that 0 with 1, then we will see the item associated with index 1, which is the second item in our array. Now this is a nested object, meaning it's an object within an object. So we have that second value of our array, but that value is an object itself. So what if we want to get the value associated with a specific key in that object? We can do this the same way we did before by saying dot and then the name of the key. And if we refresh our browser, we will only see the value associated with the key within the object at index 1 of images displayed in our console. We can also isolate this value using the square bracket method we talked about earlier. So if we refresh the page, we still get that value associated with this key. Alright, so now let's talk about our last data type, which is a function. A function is yet another type of object, and it's callable and executes a block of code. This allows us to create reusable code packages, which will make our code less repetitive, easier to maintain, and easier to debug in the future. To declare a function, we start using the function keyword, followed by open and close parentheses, and then open and close curly braces. So let's make an example down here. I'm going to say const show image equals, and then I will use the keyword function. I will have an open and close parenthesis, followed by an open and close curly brace. Now I'm going to cut and paste this console log statement within this function, and I'm going to delete our image ID key. Now the second item in our images array will be logged in our console, but not until this function is called. So if we go refresh the page, we should not see anything being logged because we haven't called our function yet. And you can see I made a rookie mistake. I redeclared a variable. So I need to change the name of this variable because we already have a variable named show image. I'm going to change that to display image and refresh. And we can see nothing is being logged in our console because this function will not execute the code within it until it's called. To invoke a function, we just say the name of the function, which is display image, followed by an open and close parenthesis. Now, if we go back to our web page and refresh it, we see that the second item in our images array is being logged. So our function is being called. But we don't want this function to be called automatically. We want it to be called on a button click. So in our HTML, let's add a button and add the text that just says show image, and we will call this method on click. I'm going to remove this extra semicolon and refresh our page. Now if we lower the console a little bit, we can see we have our show image button, and when we click it, our item is being logged in the console, which means our function is being invoked and the code within it is being executed. Now I quickly and briefly want to talk about scope. All of the variables we have declared so far have global scope. That means they were declared outside of a function, so you can use them anywhere in your script. If you declare a variable within a function, it has local scope. It is local to that function, meaning you cannot use the variable outside of the function. To demonstrate this, I'm going to declare a variable within our function called new variable, and I will set it equal to the string only available within our function. Now I'm going to log new variable within our function as well as outside of our function, and I will refresh our page. On refresh, we see an error that says new variable is not defined. This is because it's local to our function, so it only exists within our function, which is not currently being invoked. If I click the show image button, then we see the value of new variable being logged in our console. This is because now we are invoking our function, and within our function, new variable does exist. Now, if we declare new variable outside of our function, it becomes globally scoped, which means we can use it within our function and outside our function. So let's assign its value within the function and refresh our page. We'll see initially it's undefined because we have not assigned its value, but when we click the button, our method runs and we assign a value to new variable, which is then logged in our console. Now, we don't need the new variable's value, so I'm going to delete that and replace it with our images array. And now I want to be able to reuse this code to log different items in our images array depending on their index. And we can do this using parameters. By specifying parameters, this allows a function to accept input values at runtime. So we can think of the parameter almost like a placeholder. So for example, I'm going to pass in the parameter called index, and I'm going to use index to specify which index of images we're going to be logging. Now, right now, this is just the word index, but at runtime, I'm going to replace this with a value that will be passed in, and it will be a number corresponding to an index in our images array. So back down in the HTML, I'm going to create another button. Our first button is going to say show image at index 0, and our second button will say show image at index 1. And when we invoke these display image methods, we are going to pass in the corresponding index, so 0 and 1 respectively. Now if we refresh the page and click our first button, we see the object at index 0 being logged in our console. And if we click our second button, we will see the object at index 1 being displayed. So essentially, index acts as a placeholder, and when we invoke these functions, we are passing in a number, either 0 or 1, that is going to take the place of index, allowing us to display the image at that index. Now, using our dot notation, we can specify that we want to log image ID, and if we click these buttons, we see just the ID being printed in the console. So up to this point, we've really only been displaying our data in our console using the console log method. But in reality, we want to display our image in our HTML whenever the button is clicked. And to do this, we have to have an understanding of the DOM. Simply put, the DOM is a data representation of the objects that comprise the content and structure of a web document. So as you can see here, it is an object that has all of the content and information that is being displayed on our screen. With the DOM, JavaScript is able to access and change the elements of the HTML, and we can use HTML DOM methods to reference these DOM objects. So let's learn how to use DOM methods to add an image tag within a div when we click a button. To start off, let's delete the image tag we have down here already, and I'm going to replace it with a div that has an ID of photo container. Now back in our JavaScript, in our display image function, I'm going to use our DOM HTML methods to first isolate this div using document.getElementById and pasting in the ID photo container. This will isolate the div, and then we can use .innerHTML to set the inner HTML of this div. To do that, I'm going to create a string with an image tag, and this string is going to be using backticks because we're going to use template markup in it. So I'm going to add my image tag, and then up here I'm going to say var image src equals our images at specified index.image src. Now back down in our string created with backticks, I'm going to use template markup for our src. This markup allows us to use a JavaScript variable within a string, and to do that we just use a $sign and curly braces, and then we can paste the variable within those curly braces. Finally, I'm going to add a class to this image tag, and it will just be image. Now if we go back to our web page and give it a refresh and click one of the buttons, we should see the image appear on button click. And it is not working, so let's go back to our code, and in .innerHTML, all 4 of the letters HTML need to be uppercase. So this is another example of how case matters in JavaScript. Let's refresh the page and click one of our buttons, and now we see that the DOM is being manipulated and the image tag is going to be added to our HTML when the button is clicked. Back in our display image method where we are adding our image tag, let's surround the image tag in a div because I also want to display the description of the image. So I'm going to add a div here, and then within our div after our image tag I'll add a p tag which will have again template markup to display description. Now we need to define description. We're going to say var description equals, and it will be our image at specified index dot image description. Now again, let's refresh our page and click a button, and we see the image along with the image description being displayed in our HTML. Now I want to briefly compare how we would do this with Svelte. With Svelte and most other popular JavaScript frameworks, you don't manipulate the DOM yourself. The framework does that for you. So here I have our image object defined and our images array with our two objects within it. And then I still have our display image function, but this function is doing something different. So on our button clicks, we are still calling display image and passing in our index parameter, but rather than setting the inner HTML of our div, we are setting a new variable called display image equal to the object at that index. Now with Svelte, we can use our JavaScript data in our HTML. So all I'm doing is using displayed image src for our image src and our displayed image description for our description. So I'm writing all of the HTML in our actual main body area rather than appending it in our HTML by using DOM methods. Now this may sound kind of confusing because you're not familiar with any frameworks yet, but it will make a lot more sense once you start using one. And it's worth pointing out, just because you don't need to stress over all of the nitty-gritty details of manipulating the DOM, you really just need to understand the basics so that when you move up to a framework, you understand what it's doing, but you're not going to have to ever manipulate the DOM yourself, so it's not worth stressing too much over. Now that we've gone over manipulating the DOM, let's go back to our vanilla JavaScript project, and we're going to talk about conditional statements. Conditional statements allow you to write code that performs different actions based on the results of different conditions. Now to write these conditions, we're going to be using comparison operators and logical operators, which are used to test for true and false. Here is a chart with our comparison operators. The first one is a double equal sign, which means equal to, and this will be true if the two operands are equal. So in the example, 5 double equal sign 5 evaluates to true. Had that second value been 6, it would evaluate to false. Next, we have our exclamation point and equal sign, which means not equal to, and this will evaluate to true if the operands are not equal. So in our example, we have 5 is not equal to 5, which is not true, so this evaluates to false. Had that first value said 6, it would evaluate to true because 6 is in fact not equal to 5. Next, we have a triple equal sign, which is a strict equal to. This is true if the operands are equal and of the same type. So here we have 5, triple equal sign, the string 5, and this is false. Now, had we done double equal sign, this would evaluate to true because that is not checking for type. Next, we have the strict not equal to, which is the opposite of the strict equal to. For this, if the two are not equal to each other or they are not the same type, this will evaluate to true. So 5 and the string 5 are not the same type, so that is a true statement. Next, we have greater than, which is true if the operand is greater than the right operand. So 3 is greater than 2 is true. Next, we have greater than or equal to, which is just if the left operand is greater than or equal to the right. So 3 is greater than or equal to 3 evaluates to true. Next, we have the less than, which is opposite than the greater than. So if we have 3 is less than or equal to 2, that is going to be false because 3 is greater than 2. Next, for the less than or equal to, this will be the opposite of greater than or equal to. So 2 is less than or equal to 2 is true. Now here we have our logical operators, which are used to determine the logic between two variables. So first we have the logical AND, which is a double AND sign, and this will evaluate to true if both the operands are true. So for example, true and false is going to evaluate to false because that second operand is false. Now had this said 5 is greater than 3 and 2 is less than 3, this would evaluate to true because both of those statements are true. Next, we have our logical OR, which is two vertical lines, and this will evaluate to true if at least one of the operands evaluates to true. So in this case, we say true or false. This will evaluate to true because we have at least one true statement. The only time that will evaluate to false is if both operands evaluate to false. And finally, we have our logical NOT, which is an exclamation point, and this will evaluate to true if the operand is false and vice versa. So for example, if we were to say not true, that would evaluate to false. If we were to say not false, that would evaluate to true. Now we're going to write code that performs different actions based on different conditions using conditional statements. These conditional statements use expressions that evaluate to true or false, and based on these results, we can perform specific actions. So we're going to use the operators that we just went over to create these conditions. The first statement we're going to use is an if statement, and this is used to execute a block of code only if the specified condition evaluates to true. So for example, if we say if images at specified index.showImage is true, and then we cut and paste this line of code inside of our curly braces, this image tag will only be inserted into our div if this evaluates to true. So show image has to be true in order for the image to be inserted into our div. If this statement evaluates to false, then the code within this block will never run. So now up in our image object, let's change show image to false. If we click the first image, it displays because show image is true, but the second button will not update the image tag src because show image is false, so our statement will evaluate to false, and this line of code will never run. Now, we can enhance the decision making by providing an alternative choice, and we can do this by adding an else statement. This will allow us to execute one block of code if the specified condition evaluates to true, and another block of code if it evaluates to false. So in our example, let's add an else statement, and if it evaluates to false, we will run a line of code that inserts the image is hidden inside of our div instead of displaying the image. Now let's go refresh our browser and click our first button, and since show image is true, our statement will evaluate to true and that first line of code will run, inserting the image into our div. When we click our second button, this statement evaluates to false, so our else statement will run, and it will instead insert this image is hidden into our div. Now, up in our images array, I'm going to add a third object into this array, and this time I'm going to delete the image src and I'm going to make its value be null. Now back down in our if-else statement, I'm going to add an else in front of our first if statement. So it's going to say else if. And then above that, I'm going to add a new if statement that checks if image src is null. If it is null, we're going to run a line of code that is going to insert the text, no image exists. Now down in the HTML, let's add a third button, and this will pass in our index 2 so that we can display the third item in our array when this button is clicked. Now let's look at our statement, which is now an if else statement. So first we evaluate if the value of image src is null. If this is true, we are going to run this line of code that inserts no image exists into our div. Now I actually see a mistake here. I'm checking if image src is not equal to null. And so this means if image src is null, this will not evaluate to true, it will evaluate to false. We want this to evaluate to true if image is null, so let's remove the strict not equal to and change it to a strict equal to. If it's false, we're going to go on to the else if statement, which checks if show image is true. If this is true, we will insert our image. Otherwise, we will display the text, no image exists. So let's test this out. So the first object in our array has an image src and show image is true, which means we will see this image being placed inside the div. The second item in our array has an image src, but show image is false, which means our last else statement will run and display the text, this image is hidden. Finally, the last item in our array has no image src, so that first if statement will evaluate to true, so the code within this block will run and insert no image exists into our div. And since this was true, no other line of code is going to run. So now we've got 3 buttons, and when a button is clicked, it's passing in the specified index so we can display the data associated with that item in the array in our div. But we don't want a ton of buttons, and we want to show all of this data on one button click. So to do that, we're going to utilize some array methods. First, let's delete these 2 other buttons, and we will just have a single button that says show images, and delete the 0 that we're passing in. We are no longer going to be using an index parameter, so we can delete that up in our method as well. Now, the true strength of arrays lies in the JavaScript array methods, and these are methods that are built-in functions we have available to apply to arrays. Each method has a unique function that performs a change or a calculation to our array. There are a lot of different array methods, and I'm not going to go over all of them. I recommend checking out my blog, which is linked down below, because I go over all the different array methods. But there are a lot, and while you don't need to memorize them, it's really important to know that they exist, because it's going to save you a lot of time and headache in the future so that you don't have to do all of this by scratch. The one that we're going to be using today is called for each, and it calls a function for each element in the array. To use for each, we first need to say the array we want to iterate through, so images dot, and then we can use our for each method. I'm going to use the letter D to represent the current element being processed in the array. Now within these curly braces, we can write code that will be executed for each element in our array. I'm going to cut and paste our if-else statement inside of these curly braces and change anywhere I have images index to D. Now in each if-else block, we're repeating the same code saying document get element by ID photo container.inner HTML. So instead I'm going to create a variable called updated HTML, and in each if block I'm going to set our updated HTML to our new HTML string, and then at the end of this for each method I'm going to update our inner HTML to the value of our updated HTML. Now the issue with what I just did is that updated HTML is going to be changed each time we iterate through our array. So for all 3 items, the value of updated HTML is going to change, and we are going to be replacing the inner HTML with that new value. So at the end, we are only going to see whatever the last element in our array updated HTML to. So instead, outside of our for each method, let's create a new variable called var HTML, and it's just going to be an empty string. Now in each if block, after we update the value of updated HTML, we can say HTML plus equals updated HTML. This way we are not replacing the value of HTML, we are simply adding to it. So this will allow us to see all of the images and image data at the end when we append HTML to our div. Now up in our images array, I'm going to change show image to true so that we can see all the images, and I'm going to add an src to the last item in our array so we can see an image for that, and I'll just update the description as well. Now if we refresh the page and click our button, we will see all 3 images and descriptions being displayed in our HTML. Now one last change I want to make is in our for each method, I am representing each element in our array with the letter D, which is bad naming. So I'm going to update this to image, which is a better name. Now if another developer were to come in and read my code, they would know that this represents each image in our images array, whereas with the letter D, they'd have no clue what that represented. So now we have a pretty decent image library that iterates through our hard-coded images array on a button click and displays the image and its description. Now, what if we want to dynamically fetch these images from Unsplash? To do this, we need to learn how to use fetch to fetch data from an API. Now, I'm going to start by adding an input in our HTML, and I'll give this input an ID of search text. And then when we click our button, instead of calling display image, I'm going to rename that to search, and I will also change the text in our button to search. Now, up in our script, I need to create our search method. And then in our search method, I'm going to declare a new variable called keyword. And this keyword is going to be whatever the value of the input is. So we can get the value of the input by saying document.getElementById We pass in the ID of our input, which is search text, and then we say .value, and this will give us the current value of the input. Next, let's declare a new variable called endpoint, and this is going to be our API endpoint. So it's going to be the unsplash URL. So I'm going to paste that in, and you can see I'm using template syntax, so we can use keyword as our query. Next, I'm going to call a method called getImages, and I'm going to pass endpoint in as a parameter. Now down where we have our display image function, I'm going to rename that to getImages. Now in getImages, we're going to use fetch to make our network request. So to do that, we say fetch and then open and close parentheses, and we're going to need our endpoint, which is being passed in as a parameter, and we will use that parameter to pass into fetch. Now, fetch returns a promise, and I'm not going to go over what a promise is in this video, but just know that to handle that promise, we need to use .then, and this promise is going to resolve into a response object. The response object has multiple methods that we can call on it. We are going to use the JSON method, which will once again return a promise. So once again, we need to handle that promise using .then. So now we have all of the JSON data returned from our API request with all of the image information. So now I'm going to cut and paste this whole block of code inside our second .then block. And instead of looping through images, we're going to loop through our response.results. Now I'm just going to cut and paste our HTML variable down here. And then let's log our response in the console. Now let's refresh our browser and search some keyword and click search. We can see that in our console, we are having this array of 30 items logged. And once again, it's an array of image objects. Now the keys are different than what we were originally using, so let's update the image src and image description in our block of code. And show image is no longer a key, so I'm going to delete this else block. And finally, not all images are going to have a description, so up where we declare a description, let's set its value equal to image.description or the string this image has no description. Now if we refresh our page and search a keyword once again, we are seeing each image with its image description displayed in our browser. To finish off, I added some better CSS styling, which I'm not going to go over, but this will be posted to GitHub if you want to take a look at it. I will link that in the description below. And here we have our finished product. Now, this by no means encompasses the entire JavaScript language. There's so much more that you need to know. However, I think you can learn that as you learn the Svelte framework. These are just the basic concepts that I think you should know going into the framework in order to be successful. In my opinion, if you can build this image gallery and other apps similar to this and feel comfortable doing so, then you are ready to move into the Svelte framework and you can learn the rest along with Svelte. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe to my channel. Good luck with your JavaScript endeavors. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to get back to each and every one of you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.